당길 떠나!
The morning sun seemed more cruel than warm. The shadows cast across the entrance didn't hide the coldness with which he pointed the way, nor the contempt etched on his face before everyone. She held a suitcase too light to contain any dignity. No documents, no valuables, no memories. Only the emptiness of someone who had been expelled from her own life, as if guilty of something she never did. Behind him, another woman watched the scene with her arms crossed and a restrained smile, as if she already felt victorious before she'd even fought. No one cared about how she felt. No neighbors questioned her. No friends reached out to her afterward. She left silently, without explanation, without visible tears, but with something inside her that would never be destroyed, the memory of everything she had built with that man, and above all, the resolve to never again be cast aside as if she were disposable. Years passed, the world turned, and that same morning, with the same clear sky and the same impeccable facade, it was she who got out of the car with a contract in hand. The same house that had witnessed her humiliation was now for sale. And this time, he would be the one to open the door, unaware that the new name on the document was hers. But as his eyes widened in shock and his lover tried to understand what was happening, the only question hanging in the air was, how did someone who was kicked out with nothing come back to buy everything? If this turnaround surprised you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss the next stories about how life turns around. Years before that rainy morning in Gangnam, the story of Min-Jae Han and Hye-Rin Park seemed to come straight out of a modern tale of overcoming. They met when they were young, in Busan, when they shared dreams and debts, living in a small apartment with damp walls, where the sound of traffic mingled with the constant hum of the fan that fought against the suffocating heat of the Korean summer. Min-Jae was an ambitious boy, determined to escape the shadow of poverty, while Hye-Rin, with her serenity and generosity, believed in the future they could build together. She was the one who first believed in his talent when he was nothing more than an intern at a small logistics company. While Min-Jae spent sleepless nights trying to excel at work, it was Hye-Rin who prepared simple meals to support him, who saved every last bit of her part-time salary as a private tutor for children, and who hid her own tears so as not to add to the burden already weighing on him. Their love wasn't made of luxury or exaggerated promises, but of small, discreet, and consistent gestures that formed the foundation of everything that would later be celebrated by society as Min-Jae's empire. When they finally managed to move to Seoul, Hye-Rin remained the quiet force behind her husband's achievements. While he rose to prominence in elegant meetings, she tended the home, organized documents, reviewed contracts, and became his confidant in moments of uncertainty. Often, it was her calm intuition that helped him avoid serious mistakes. However, as time passed, the line between support and sacrifice began to blur. Hye-Rin no longer had room for herself, as her life revolved around maintaining balance for an increasingly distant man. Recognition never came. At corporate events, Min-Jae introduced her as just his wife, without mentioning how much she had contributed to each step of his climb. Between forced smiles and scornful looks from other high society wives, Hye-Rin grew accustomed to feeling invisible. Even so, she believed that love could withstand the transformation that power wrought within her. She dreamed of starting a family, of filling the house with children's laughter, but her plans were constantly postponed with excuses that it wasn't the right time. What Hye-Rin didn't realize was that, little by little, Min-Jae's priority was no longer her, but maintaining the image of an untouchable, coveted, and admired CEO. He was beginning to trade the intimacy of married life for the applause at lavish dinners, where the glitter of golden chandeliers replaced the warmth of simplicity that once united them. In the eyes of society, they were an enviable couple, the successful man and his discreet, elegant wife. But behind closed doors, Hye-Rin saw a coldness taking over their relationship. Smiles became rare, conversations were reduced to orders and demands, and the emotional distance grew wider with each passing week. Still, she believed it was just a phase. After all, she had seen the worst of life with him, and she wouldn't give up now, when she believed they were about to finally reap the rewards of all their hard work. What Hye-Rin didn't know was that the root of the separation already had a name, a perfume, and a calculated smile. A name that would soon change the course of her life forever, taking away not only her marriage, but also the dignity she had spent years silently preserving. And it was in this growing emptiness that the presence of another woman began to occupy the space that was previously only hers. The first sign of change came almost imperceptibly, like a breeze heralding a storm before the heavens open in fury. Min-Jae, once dedicated and hardworking, began arriving home later and later. His excuses were always the same: endless meetings, business dinners, commitments that couldn't be postponed. Hye-Rin, still believing in the loyalty that bound them, accepted his explanations, even when her heart told her something was wrong. It was at one of these corporate dinners that the name of So-hee began to circulate among directors and investors. Young, elegant and ambitious, So-hee was not only an exemplary employee, but also a woman who knew how to use her presence to capture attention. With understated dresses and calculated gestures, she earned the trust of those around her. But behind every smile was a sharp gaze that aimed at goals far greater than simple promotions. Hye-Rin first heard about her through vague comments. "That new manager is really brilliant. No wonder the CEO trusts her so much." At first, she dismissed it as a coincidence. After all, Min-Jae had always worked surrounded by competent people. But the signs began to mount. He, who once shared at least one meal with his wife, now rarely showed up at home, citing last-minute travel. His cell phone, which used to sit on the table, was now locked in his pocket. Messages were responded to hurriedly, and each answering call was followed by a distant look. Little by little, the home that once held small displays of affection became a cold space, illuminated by Min-Jae's computer screen, or the glitter of the expensive jewelry she bought to compensate for her absences. But no jewelry filled the void of silence, and Hye-Rin realized she was losing not only her husband, but herself as well. The height of indifference came when, one night, when trying to talk about their future, Min-Jae responded coldly, "You're paranoid, Hye-Rin. You need to stop imagining things." Those words cut deep. It was as if he'd transformed her pain into a weakness to be ridiculed. Meanwhile, So-hee was gaining more and more traction. In the company corridors, everyone noticed the closeness between her and the CEO. She always appeared at his side at important meetings, was his right-hand woman at public events, and rumors swirled that they were already traveling together under the guise of strategic partnerships. Employees whispered, but no one dared confront their boss. Hye-Rin, isolated, felt the weight of betrayal even before she saw it blatantly. Her intuition told her that her husband was no longer the man she'd known in Busan. Each sleepless night, she stared at the empty bed and tried to convince herself that there was still salvation, that perhaps it was just the stress of CEO life. But deep inside, a knot tightened her chest, announcing that emotional ruin was about to explode. The love that had sustained her for so many years was being eroded by well-rehearsed lies and smiles exchanged in places she no longer frequented. Hye-Rin was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a lover taking up space in her life. but a silent war for her own dignity. And what began as rumors and hushed silences in company hallways would soon turn into a public humiliation impossible to forget. The night was lit by the crystal lights that hung from the immense event hall in the heart of Alone. It was Min-Jae's annual company party, a spectacle where business people, politicians and journalists vied for attention amid glasses of champagne and classical music played live by a discreet orchestra. For Hye-Rin, this was yet another commitment that, despite its unpleasantness, was part of the role she had learned to play, the silent wife of the powerful man. She chose a navy blue dress, elegant, yet simple, with her hair tied in a delicate bun. She wasn't looking to stand out, just to support her husband and show that she was still by his side, even though her heart already bore invisible scars. She walked with firm steps, trying to ignore the curious glances that followed her, looks that seemed to whisper truths she didn't want to hear. When Min-Jae took the stage to deliver his speech, everyone's attention was drawn to him. In a firm voice, he spoke of growth, of business victories, and how this would be just the beginning of an era of expansion. Each word was followed by applause, and Hye-Rin, at the back of the audience, felt pride and pain mingling in silence. Then, mid-speech, he turned his gaze to the crowd, and with a calculated gesture called, "Sohee Kimto go on stage." The young woman, stunning in a red dress, crossed the room amidst a hail of gazes. Murmurs began to spread, and Hye-Rin, paralyzed, felt her heart race. Min-Jae not only introduced her as the key to the company's success, but also held her hand intimately for a long time, as if he wanted everyone to see. It was at that moment that the final blow was struck. With a cold smile, he removed the ring from her finger and, in front of hundreds of guests, let the metal fall to the floor, producing a dry sound that echoed like a sentence. "From today on, my life takes a different direction," he said without hesitation, as the room fell into an awkward silence. Hye-Rin felt her legs tremble, but she couldn't move. The world seemed to spin around her, as if every light were focused on her pain. So he, beside her, wore a triumphant look, and the timid applause that followed felt like knives piercing the chest of a woman she had only ever loved. Some guests looked away, others whispered among themselves, but no one dared approach. She became invisible amidst the crowd, which now saw her as a discarded burden. The whispers became unbearable, and each step she took out of the room seemed to drag with it the dignity Min-Jae had stripped away in public. Outside, the cold night air hit her like a punch, but it also brought clarity. Tears streamed down her face as she walked alone down the lit street, unsure of where to go. In that moment, she realized it wasn't just her marriage that was over, but her entire life as she knew it. The silence that night was more painful than any scream, and even without strength, a dark seed germinated within her, the desire to never again allow anyone to treat her as invisible. But what she didn't yet know was that the real fall hadn't begun that night, and that the emptiness that would follow would transform her into something much greater. The streets of Seoul seemed colder that night, even with the vibrant lights reflecting off the glass of the skyscrapers. Hye-Rin walked aimlessly, her eyes watering and her heart breaking, carrying on her shoulders the weight of a humiliation no one should ever have to endure. Each step was accompanied by memories that burned like open wounds. Min-Jae's cold gaze, Sohee's triumphant smile, the poisoned whispers of the guests. Everything mingled in her mind, transforming the silence into a deafening internal scream. Arriving at the small apartment she had hurriedly rented after being evicted from the mansion, she sat on the floor, unable to find the strength to lie down on the bed. That space with its narrow walls and cracked window was not a home, but a makeshift shelter from a world that seemed to conspire against her. There, she let her pain overflow. She cried until she was exhausted, remembering every sacrifice she had made, every dream postponed, every moment she had believed love would be enough. In the days that followed, loneliness became her only companion. Min-Jae's absence was so heavy, it seemed to fill every corner of the room. Food lost its flavor, sleep was plagued by nightmares, and mornings became repetitions of a meaningless routine. She worked in late night cafes, serving customers who treated her with indifference, and then got a job as a secretary in a small office in Daegu. The salary barely covered the bills, but it was still proof that, even broke, she could keep going. Hye-Rin retreated into silence. She avoided old friends, refused invitations from family, and distanced herself from everything that reminded her of the life she had lost. Her heart closed, and the smiles faded from her face. Those who saw her believed she was defeated, but behind the pain, a dormant strength began to awaken. It was like a fragile flame, hidden beneath the ashes, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The emotional scars didn't disappear overnight, but they shaped a new woman. A woman who learned to survive amid abandonment, who discovered the harshness of the world without the protection of a powerful family name, but also began to realize that she didn't need anyone to exist. And it was at this rock bottom, amidst silent tears and sleepless nights, that a decision began to form within her. She would never again allow herself to be discarded. Never again would she let anyone silence her. The suffering that seemed to crush her would, in time, become the strength that would lift her up. And it was in the silence of this solitary reconstruction that Hye-Rin began, without anyone noticing, to write the first page of her true revenge. The following years were filled with silence, discipline, and sacrifice. Hye-Rin, still, scarred by the memories of the night she lost everything, decided she would not allow pain to be her eternal prison. Working as a secretary in a small office in Daegu, she began to closely observe every detail of the business routine. While typing contracts or serving coffee to executives, she absorbed strategies, numbers, and terms that for many were just bureaucracy, but for her became lessons in disguise. With each page she reviewed, Hye-Rin learned. At each meeting, she listened to in silence, she recorded information that seemed invaluable. At home, away from everyone's gaze, she spent nights studying. She bought used business books, followed economic news, and, little by little, built a knowledge that no one could take away. Her modest life was no longer sustained by the naivete of expecting support from anyone, but by the certainty that one day she would achieve her own independence. It wasn't easy. Hye-Rin endured days when she barely had enough money to pay the rent, nights when she cried from exhaustion upon arriving home, and humiliations from colleagues who saw her as a defeated woman. But she transformed each wound into fuel. She cherished the memories of Min-Jae's cold gaze and So-hee's arrogant smile, memories that motivated her to never give up. The first step in his turnaround came when he managed to save a small amount. Courageously, he invested in a simple apartment in a growing area. The risk was high, but his intuition was spot on. A few years later, the property appreciated and yielded enough to buy a second property, and so began his discreet empire. No fanfare, no ostentation, just planning and determination. While many believed Hye-Rin had disappeared, she was, in fact, silently writing a new story. She became invisible to the eyes of the past, but each deal closed, each investment signed, was a solid foundation stone in the construction of the future she was designing. Pain was transformed into discipline, and discipline into power. The world didn't know it, but the woman who once left with empty suitcases now carried within her the most precious treasure, the ability to be reborn. And as her name began to quietly surface in investor circles, fate prepared an inevitable twist. Because while Hye-Rin quietly built her life, Min-Jae's empire began to show the first signs of ruin. And it was just as she began to prosper that Min-Jae's world began to crumble, and fate finally aligned its accounts. While Hye-Rin, in the silence of her determination, transformed small investments into pillars of a solid empire, the world of Min-Jae Han was beginning to crack. This man who, for years, had been celebrated as an example of intelligence and leadership, now faced headwinds that his arrogance prevented him from seeing. It all started with poorly signed contracts. Risky deals, made more out of vanity than strategy, began to weigh on the company. So he, the mistress who once seemed the perfect partner, showed a calculating and ruthless side. She knew how to manipulate meetings, lead conversations, and above all, use Min-Jae's prestige to further her own interests. What seemed like support soon revealed itself as control. Investors who had previously trusted the CEO blindly began to suspect rash decisions. Reports began to show worrying declines, and the murmurs in the hallways, previously silenced by fear, became increasingly loud voices of dissatisfaction. However, Min-Jae, blinded by his own arrogance, refused to admit mistakes. For him, any obstacles were the fault of incompetent subordinates, never his own choices. Meanwhile, So-hee capitalized on the chaos. She used the instability as an opportunity to divert resources, create secret alliances, and position herself as the true mastermind behind the company. There were nights when Min-Jae would find her whispering on the phone, but when he questioned her, he received only a smile and a soft apology. Enough for him, still confident in his dominance, to let it slide. The ever-vigilant press began publishing discreet stories, failed multi-million-dollar projects, broken partnerships, veiled accusations of corruption. Little by little, Min-Jae's impeccable image was crumbling. The man who had driven his wife away in the name of victory now found himself surrounded by invisible enemies and the shadow of distrust. The weight of the fall wasn't limited to the corporate world. At home, the relationship with So-hee was no longer one of smiles and promises, but of arguments and demands. The woman who once boasted of having stolen Hye-Rin's throne now displayed impatience, contempt, and coldness. And for Min-Jae, home was no longer a refuge. It became another arena for silent disputes and humiliations. The irony was cruel. At the same time, Hye-Rin ascended with discreet steps. Min-Jae descended, blinded by pride. What he could never have imagined was that their two seemingly distant paths would soon cross again. As he reviewed reports in his office, illuminated by the nightlights of Seoul, Min-Jae felt for the first time a shiver of fear. Something told him this wasn't just bad luck or bad decisions. It was as if fate was calling in an old debt. A debt he believed he'd buried the day he closed the gate behind Hye-Rin. And though he tried to convince himself he still had everything under control, the void around him began to scream. Partners were pulling away, allies were switching sides, and even his employees no longer regarded him with respect, but with distrust. The empire that had seemed eternal was now trembling from within. And it was just when the fall seemed inevitable that fate brought back the face he never expected to see again. And that would change everything forever. Winter in Seoul had arrived with a vengeance that year. The biting wind cut through expensive coats and closed windows, bringing with it a sense of unease that seemed to reflect the state of life in Min-Jae Han. Gangnam Mansion, once the site of lavish parties, was now shrouded in a heavy silence, marked by debt and the shadow of imminent bankruptcy. Word spread quickly. The property was being put up for sale. Min-Jae, still trying to maintain his powerful posture, was summoned to the law firm that would broker the deal. Upon arrival, he stepped out of his imported car with firm steps, but his eyes betrayed sleepless nights and the insecurity of someone watching his reputation crumble. He climbed the marble steps, crossed the glass-enclosed lobby, and entered the meeting room, expecting to find ordinary investors, perhaps curious or opportunistic, ready to buy into his former glory. When the door opened, time seemed to freeze. At the head of the table, seated with impeccable elegance, she was Hye-Rin Park. He wore a sober suit in shades of grey and black, which contrasted with the warmth of his serene gaze. The same look he had once despised now reflected unshakable confidence. For a moment, Min-Jae believed he was witnessing a mirage. The woman he had thrown out with empty suitcases was there, not as a spectator, but as a protagonist. Silence fell over the room. Lawyers and brokers glanced at each other, sensing the tension in the air. Hye-Rin took her time. She let the discomfort sink in before speaking, calmly leafing through some papers. Her every move was calculated, every gesture carrying the silent message that life had changed, and he was no longer the master of anyone's fate. "Mr. Han," she said, her voice firm and calm, "it's a pleasure to see you again." Those simple, polite words pierced Min-Jae like sharp blades. He tried to maintain his composure, straightening his jacket and forcing a smile, but the cold sweat on his forehead betrayed the impact. As the lawyers explained the terms of the negotiation, Hye-Rin remained calm. There was no arrogance in her posture, only the confidence of someone who knows the value of their own efforts. She listened attentively to every detail, and at one point lifted the golden pen resting on the table. Min-Jae followed the movement with his eyes, as if the object were the sword that would seal his defeat. When he finally signed the contract, the sound of the pen scratching the paper echoed through the room like a verdict. Min-Jae felt the ground slip beneath his feet. That mansion, a symbol of triumph and power he had once believed to be eternal, now belonged to the woman he had cast to the ground in humiliation. Hye-Rin slowly got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow-covered city. There was no rancor on her face, only the serenity of someone who understood that the most powerful revenge is not made of screams or tears, but of silent victories. She turned to him and added, "Curious, isn't it? Some gates that close one day end up opening, but only for those who have the courage to wait." Min-Jae didn't answer. His lips trembled and his eyes welled up, but he didn't dare show weakness in front of everyone. He simply lowered his head, unable to face the woman he'd thought defeated years ago. In that instant, the entire room understood that this wasn't just a real estate deal, but a settling of scores, and the balance finally tipped in Hye-Rin's favor. But if the reunion had already shattered him, what came next would be even more cruel, the desperate attempt to reconquer what he himself had destroyed. In the days following the signing of the contract, Min-Jae Han was consumed by a whirlwind of contradictory feelings. His wounded pride told him he should ignore what had happened, treat the return of Hye-Rin Park as a mere business accident. But the emptiness of his sold mansion and the memory of her firm stance eroded his peace night after night. Lying in a room that no longer belonged to him, he remembered the woman he had thrown out with her empty suitcases. Now that same woman returned as an enigma impossible to erase. The first attempt at rapprochement was timid. He sent flowers to Hye-Rin's new address, an expensive bouquet, accompanied by a hastily written card. "I miss you. Let's talk." She received the flowers in silence, stared at them for a few seconds, and then left them in the building's lobby, without even taking them inside. There was no rancor in the gesture, just indifference. Min-Jae didn't give up. He began sending text messages, some long, filled with memories of his time in Busan, others short, simply begging for a response. But each message went unanswered. For a man accustomed to having the world at his feet, Hye-Rin's silence was more devastating than any harsh words. When he finally worked up the courage to meet her in person, he chose to wait for her in front of the new building where she lived. The chilly night wind bit his face as he nervously watched each car that pulled up outside the entrance. And then she appeared, stepping out of the back seat of an elegant vehicle, dressed in a dark overcoat and accompanied by 2 aides. The shock was even greater. Hye-Rin was not just a casual buyer, but a budding entrepreneur. "Hye-Rin," he murmured, his voice breaking, running to her. "Please listen to me. I know I messed up, but I can change." She stood before him for a few seconds, assessing him with the same calm gaze that had disconcerted him at the meeting. Her lips moved slowly, and her answer was as sharp as an invisible cut. "Min-Jae, what is broken cannot be fixed with words." Without raising his voice, he walked towards the lobby and disappeared, leaving him paralyzed in the biting cold. Desperate, he tried everything. He called old mutual friends, reached out to her family, sent expensive gifts. But nothing could shake the wall of silence Hye-Rin had erected around herself. Every gesture he made seemed small compared to the greatness she now displayed. And with each rejection, his self-image as an invincible man crumbled. The company's once bright corridors now suffocated him. The looks of his subordinates carried contempt, and even so his presence became unbearable. The emptiness he had previously tried to fill with arrogance now became a hole impossible to hide. And it was in this growing despair that Hye-Rin revealed her true victory, not with screams, but with the silent justice that would forever mark his fate. The day of the mansion's official transfer arrived shrouded in an atmosphere that seemed to carry more than bureaucracy. It was as if fate itself had chosen that moment to seal a reckoning. The notary's office was filled with lawyers, brokers and assistants, all busy with paperwork, stamps and documents. But none of that mattered in the face of the true spectacle, Hye-Rin Park sitting with impeccable posture, and in front of her the once powerful Min-Jae Han, who now trembled before inevitable defeat. He tried in vain to start a conversation. He talked about memories, about the past, about the sacrifices he said they had both made. But each word seemed lost in the void, hitting a wall erected by Hye-Rin's firm silence. She didn't need to raise her voice to assert herself. Her presence spoke louder than any speech. When the pen was placed in her hands, Hye-Rin took a deep breath and signed the deed with the calmness of someone no longer burdened by pain, but only the certainty of victory. The sound of the paper being stamped echoed through the room like a final sentence. Min-Jae, hunched in his chair, felt that in that moment he wasn't just losing property. He was handing over the last symbol of power he still believed he possessed. Hours later, the scene repeated itself before the mansion's gates. This time, it was Hye-Rin who arrived in an elegant car, greeted by the security guards who now worked for her. She stepped out with firm steps, her eyes fixed on the gate that years ago had slammed shut behind her. The golden iron looked the same, but its meaning had changed completely. It was no longer the symbol of defeat, but the trophy of a silent comeback. Min-Jae, standing outside, watched with teary eyes. The man who had once thrown her out with empty suitcases was now merely a spectator to her victory. Every second that passed before that scene corroded his soul. He tried to approach, but was gently blocked by security. Hye-Rin, without even raising her voice, simply gave him a serene look, a look that carried more power than any loud revenge could offer. Inside the mansion, she walked slowly through the rooms. Each room seemed to hold memories of the past. The silent dinners, the lonely nights, the hallways marked by contempt. But now everything had a new meaning. She no longer cried, no longer felt anger. She simply walked with the calm of someone who understands that the greatest justice is to see the arrogant bow before their own ruin. As Min-Jae stood outside, overcome with shame, neighbors began to notice the scene. Some approached discreetly, whispering about how the story had turned out. Word would travel fast. The CEO who had humiliated his wife had lost his own home to her, and there was nothing that could erase the weight of this public defeat. That night, sitting alone in a car parked in front of the mansion he no longer owned, Min-Jae felt his heart sink as never before. For the first time, he realized he had lost not just a piece of property, but the woman who had once been his rock and who was now beyond his reach. But the defeat at the gates was only the beginning. The true punishment would come in the silence of memories, when the weight of regret would crush him mercilessly. The days following the loss of the mansion were like a plunge into icy waters. For Min-Jae Han, accustomed to being revered, to having doors opened and forced smiles everywhere, he now walked the streets with the shadow of shame following every step. Newspaper headlines were full of irony. CEO's empire crumbles, and ex-wife takes over Gangnam Mansion. The man who had once been seen as a symbol of victory now became the butt of jokes at cafe tables and in gossip columns. In his once bustling office, only the echo of a lost power remained. Min-Jae spent hours sitting in his leather chair, staring out the window at the city, as if waiting for someone to knock on the door and restore him to his former glory. But no one came. Phone calls became rare, invitations ceased, and even his closest allies chose silence as a way to distance themselves from his ruin. So he, realizing there was no benefit in staying by his side, disappeared without saying goodbye. She left only a cold note. "I can't sync with you." Min-Jae read those words dozens of times until they became useless because there was no surprise left. Deep down, I knew she had never been there for love, but for the glow that was now fading. Alone, he sought comfort in memories he had previously despised. He looked at old photographs of Hye-Rin Park. He remembered her smile in Busan, the simple meals she prepared with care, the nights she believed in him when no one else did. These images, which he had once considered banal, now cut him like daggers. He, who had always believed the world revolved around his ambition, discovered too late that the true foundation of his life had been the woman he had ruthlessly cast out. One night, faced with overwhelming loneliness, Min-Jae lifted a glass of wine that no longer had any taste and muttered to himself, "What is left for a man when he loses even the right to be remembered?" With respect, the answer came in silence. A silence that became unbearable, as if every shadow in the room whispered of his failure. And it was in this devastating void that Hye-Rin, for the last time, showed the world that pain can turn into victory, and that some stories don't need forgiveness to find closure. On that frigid night, the mansion's lights shone like jewels against the dark Gangnam sky, reflecting off the stained glass windows and polished surfaces, scattering sparkles that seemed to dance to the sound of the cold wind that blew through the city's silent streets. For the first time in many years, Hye-Rin Park walked through those hallways not as an unwelcome visitor, but as its true owner, with the authority and confidence that only those who have overcome the deepest pain can carry. Each step she took on the marble echoed softly but firmly, bringing with it memories that, though still present, no longer paralyzed her. They were wounds that were beginning to heal, transforming each painful memory into fuel for her silent strength. The walls, once silent witnesses to humiliation and injustice, now seemed to welcome her presence, recognizing the courage of a woman who chose not to be defined by suffering, but by overcoming it. She walked to the grand living room, a space where she had so often felt diminished, humiliated, and powerless in the face of contemptuous looks and cruel comments. The emptiness of the space now brought no pain, but a strange and powerful sense of peace. Hye-Rin closed her eyes, allowing herself to recall every detail of that day she left the mansion with empty suitcases, carrying only the weight of disappointment and uncertainty about the future. The tears that marked her departure were gone. In their place was only a discreet smile, almost imperceptible, but charged with a victory that didn't need to be celebrated with applause. It was the silent victory of someone who had managed to regain her own life, even in the face of those who believed they would tear her down forever. She opened the windows and let the cool night wind invade the space, bringing with it a sense of freedom. She took a deep breath, feeling every muscle relax and every thought clear. As she exhaled, she whispered to herself, as if sealing a pact with her own strength. Today, I no longer carry pain. Today, I carry victory. Each word was a reminder that the power of reconstruction lies within those who choose not to bow to circumstances, that every challenge faced is a step toward a future that belongs only to those with the courage to walk. Outside, Min-Jae remained a shadow of her former self, consumed by regret and loneliness. Powerless to challenge Hye-Rin's determination, fate had given its answer, and she didn't need to look back. The future lay before her, shining as brightly as the lights of the city that never slept, carrying promises of achievement, autonomy, and growth. In that moment, she understood that there is no greater revenge than rebuilding and thriving in the face of those who believed in her downfall. Every choice she made, every step she took, was proof that her life now belonged completely to her, free from the shadows of the past. If this story moved you and touched your soul, subscribe to the channel now. Even more intense and surprising stories await you, and the next one will leave you speechless, showing that courage, strength, and resilience can transform any pain into freedom.